Hello and welcome everyone to the third Core Humanities Speaker Series event of 2021-2022. My name is Breton Rodriguez and I am the Assistant Director of the Core Humanities program here at the University of Nevada, Reno. Before introducing our speaker, Dr. David Rondell, I would like to quickly outline the plan for the evening. Dr. Rondell will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will open things up for questions from the audience. If you have a question during his talk, please just go ahead and put that question into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rondell. Dr. Rondell is the Interim Director of Core Humanities in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Nevada, Reno. He is also an Associate Professor in the Philosophy Department at UNR, where he teaches an assortment of courses in social, political, and legal philosophy. He is the author of Pragmatist Egalitarianism from Oxford University Press, and the editor or co-editor of 3 other books: Pragmatism and Justice by Oxford University Press again, Pessimism of the Intellect, Optimism of the Will, The Political Philosophy of K. Nielsen by the University of Calgary Press, and most recently, The Cambridge Companion to Rorty by Cambridge University Press. And he is currently working on a book project which explores some of the connections between philosophy and anxiety. So take it away, David.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Breton, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone who's tuned in. Thank you for tuning in, especially those of you tuning in here in Nevada. This is a holiday weekend for us here in Nevada. And so I extra appreciate your tuning in as well. Let me just share my screen really quickly, and that'll help get us started. While that's happening, I do want to take just a moment to thank Joe Crowley, the late Joe Crowley, and as well the Joe Crowley Family Foundation for their generous support in creating this professorship that I'm honored to be the current holder of. And I'm also grateful to Breton Rodriguez, whom you just heard from, and also Chris Stansel in the Core Humanities office for all their help in organizing and preparing and getting this lecture ready to be aired for all of you. Okay, well, this is my lecture, Another Lap in the Race, Arthur Schopenhauer on Suffering and the Will, and I'll get into it. And hopefully after this presentation, there'll be some time for questions and discussion, which I greatly look forward to as well. Okay, so Friedrich Nietzsche once said about Arthur Schopenhauer that he was, in Nietzsche's words, the only serious moral philosopher of the 19th century. What Nietzsche apparently admires so much about Schopenhauer, what makes him singularly serious in Nietzsche's view, was his willingness, as Nietzsche puts it, quote, to descend into the depths of existence with a string of curious questions on his lips. This is quoting from Nietzsche. Why do I live? What lesson have I to learn from life? How have I become what I am, and why do I suffer from being what I am? Close quote. Schopenhauer's answers to these questions were, there's simply no other way to put it, unprecedentedly pessimistic and gloomy. Suffering is both overwhelming and inescapable, he believed. The world is bankrupt and irredeemable. Happiness is a mirage, always just out of our reach. The future is bleak. Life, for the vast majority of us, even if it contains episodic moments of joy and fulfillment, probably isn't worth it in the end. Fun stuff, yes. So Schopenhauer had a great deal to say about the suffering that's inherent in human life, and I'll have something to say about that this evening, of course. But more particularly, I want to describe a puzzle about our will that is at the center of Schopenhauer's pessimistic worldview. And then I'll consider some possible ways that that puzzle might be, at least in part, resolved by turning to the work of 2 decisively less pessimistic thinkers. One is contemporary MIT philosophy professor Kiran Setia, who, by the way, just gave a talk to our philosophy department here at UNR a couple of weeks ago. So I think it's timely to be talking about his work this evening. And the second thinker that I'll be drawing from is the Zen master Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. So yeah, a little bit of an interesting trio that we'll be drawing from today. But let me begin by maybe offering a few biographical remarks about quite possibly the gloomiest philosopher of all time, Arthur Schopenhauer. So yeah, I like to think of Schopenhauer as the GOAT, the gloomiest of all time. Okay. So a few biographical snippets. So I think it puts the point mildly to say that Schopenhauer was an odd and extremely difficult person. By all accounts, he was gruff, eccentric, rude, and bombastic. He trusted almost no one. This is well known about him. One famous anecdote recounts that Schopenhauer was so paranoid that he wouldn't let his barber shave his neck. He would also sleep with a loaded pistol by his bed and sometimes even a sword. And he very famously as well detested noise, so badly, in fact, that he once shoved a woman down a flight of stairs because she was apparently being too loud. Schopenhauer was undoubtedly, despite some of these faults of his, was undoubtedly a brilliant and unique philosopher, perhaps the only philosopher of his time and place to take Hindu and Buddhist thought seriously, and I'll have something to say about that later on. But given his complete ineptitude in the arena of human relations, it's not surprising, perhaps, that he could never secure a paid university post. Human relations were, for Schopenhauer, a perpetual struggle. He sometimes, in fact, seemed to prefer the company of animals, especially his beloved poodles. And I think I have a picture here of Schopenhauer with his beloved poodle, which he named Atman, which of course is the famous Hindu concept of self or essence, hard to translate, obviously. We know that Schopenhauer enjoyed the company of women, and he had biographers tell us, a voracious sex drive. But again, sexual relations were, for him, like his other human dealings, consistently a source of frustration and disappointment. As one biographer explains, quote, "The women he was disposed to love would not sleep with him, and the women who would sleep with him, whores and actresses, he did not love," close quote. Schopenhauer, in fact, had baffling Neanderthal views about women. The 1851 essay on women is a completely unhinged and intensely misogynistic rant. In that essay, he argues, among other things, that women are well suited to work as nurses and teachers, quote from Schopenhauer, precisely because they are themselves childish, silly, and short-sighted, close quote. Whether and to what extent these views can be attributed to Schopenhauer's unluckiness in love, I will leave it to his biographers to determine in full. Okay, so at the heart of Schopenhauer's pessimistic worldview is a dilemma about the will, about our human will. Schopenhauer believed that, as he puts it, life is an endless striving. Every person has goals and desires, and everything a person does and refrains from doing can be explained in terms of striving towards their fulfillment. If we were to have asked Schopenhauer why these goals and desires exist in the first place, which is to say why we are endowed with a will at all, the question would have been dismissed as, his word, absurd. The existence of the will is, as he says, self-evident, fundamental. It's just there. Nothing further about its primal origins can be known, he thinks. So we are essentially striving creatures, always wanting or doing something, always striving. And yet, according to Schopenhauer, a modicum of suffering, of pain, of want and toil is inherent in this relentless striving. This is because, according to Schopenhauer, all of our striving springs from deprivation, that's his phrase, from discontent with one's condition. Bluntly put, we strive because we're unsatisfied with how things presently are. Without deprivation and discontent, so Schopenhauer believes, we wouldn't be inclined to want or do anything. So suffering and deprivation in this respect keeps us going. It's like the gasoline that keeps our metaphorical engines running. As Schopenhauer writes, quote, "One can even say that we require at all times a certain quantity of care or sorrow or want, as a ship requires ballast in order to keep on a straight course," close quote. We obviously feel unhappy when things don't work out as we hope or want or expected them to work out. Unsatisfied desire provokes frustration. Of course, we all know that. But Schopenhauer thinks that we, in a sense, need these sorrows and wants and desires. Without them, we would be rudderless and lost. Life would be dreadful, he thinks. It would be a stultifying boredom. If these sorrows and wants were removed from life, where would we find motivation? What would spur us on? To what end and in the name of what would we strive? So Schopenhauer's dilemma about the will comes into focus for us when we realize that it's virtually impossible, not entirely impossible, but almost impossible to overcome the suffering produced by the will. And so here is an important passage from the famous essay on the suffering of the world, which Schopenhauer published in 1850. Schopenhauer writes, "Work, worry, toil, and trouble are indeed the lot of almost all men their whole life long. And yet, if every desire were satisfied as soon as it arose, how would men occupy their lives? How would they pass the time? Imagine this race transported to a utopia where everything grows of its own accord and turkeys fly around ready roasted, where lovers find one another without any delay and keep one another without any difficulty. In such a place, some men would die of boredom or hang themselves. Some would fight and kill one another, and thus they would create for themselves more suffering than nature inflicts on them as it is." This gives us a little taste, I think, as well, of Schopenhauer's unprecedented gloominess as well. But here's the dilemma, right? If we are unsuccessful in our strivings, if we don't achieve what we set out to achieve, obviously we'll be frustrated and unhappy. But if we are successful, and this is Schopenhauer's crucial insight, we will immediately need new wants and desires to replace the freshly satisfied old ones. As he says, and this is the impetus for the title of my talk tonight, every goal attained is the starting point of a new lap in the race, and so on ad infinitum. There's no getting off this treadmill. Every goal attained, Schopenhauer believes, is merely the beginning of a new striving. And so here's another illustrative passage from Schopenhauer's most famous work, The World as Will and Idea, published in the year 1819. Schopenhauer writes, quote, "No attained object of desire can give lasting satisfaction, but merely a fleeting gratification. It's like alms thrown to the beggar, keeping him alive today so that his misery may be prolonged till the morrow. Therefore, as long as our consciousness is filled by our will, in other words, as long as we're wanting stuff, as long as we are given up to the urgent prompting of desires with their constant hopes and fears, as long as we are the subject of willing, we can never have lasting happiness or peace," close quote. The unfortunate conclusion, of course, is that a kind of suffering is essential to life, as Schopenhauer puts it, and cannot be thrown off. Inescapably, Schopenhauer thinks, want and boredom are the twin poles of human life. If we have no desires or goals, we'll languish in boredom. If we do have desires and goals, we'll either fail to achieve them, which is painful and frustrating, or we'll be successful in achieving them, in which case we shall immediately need something new towards which to strive, lest we fall back into that abyss of boredom. So we're in a tough spot, I think, is one way to put it. Now, this is probably clear to some of you who are listening, but I think it's clear that Schopenhauer's thinking, particularly in this, in sketching this dilemma about our will, is importantly indebted to Buddhist thought. This dilemma about the relentless striving of the will overlaps neatly, indeed, with the first two noble truths of the Buddha, which famously proclaim that, number one, all existence is suffering, or dukkha, as it's called in the original Pali and subsequently Sanskrit. And second noble truth, that the cause of that suffering is craving or wanting things. Like the Buddhist thinkers to whom he is indebted, Schopenhauer thinks we're stuck on a treadmill. There's desire or craving, then a bit of momentary satisfaction if and when the desire is satiated, then boredom, which invariably leads back again to desire, and so on and so forth for the rest of our days. Unless we can find some way to get beyond desire itself, right? Unless we can achieve the cessation of craving, the overcoming of desire that Buddha's third noble truth expounds, suffering of one kind or another will always be there. Okay, so as I read it anyways, I think that Schopenhauer's dilemma about the will conveys something sad and tragic about human life. It accentuates feelings of futility, of repetition, the emptiness of satisfied desire, of life's overwhelming effortfulness. It seems to ask, what's the point of all this striving? Is this tedious, exhausting sequence of tasks and projects and successes really all there is? What does it all come to in the end? It's all so hopeless and tiring. Why bother? That's at least the sort of subtext of the dilemma that I think I read. But as MIT philosopher Kiran Setia has recently shown in his brilliant book, Midlife, A Philosophical Guide, Schopenhauer's dilemma also speaks to the powerful sense of disquiet and restlessness that many people feel at midlife and perhaps at other points in their life as well. In fact, Setia explicitly connects Schopenhauer's dilemma with these kinds of feelings. He begins by telling us that life at the age of 40 is rich and rewarding. It's filled with valuable pursuits and accomplishments, with travel and excitement, fulfilling work, family and friends. And yet, when Setia considers his life as a whole, something seems inexplicably, disconcertingly off. Here's a passage that I must confess really resonates with me, a fellow early 40-year-old philosophy professor as well. Yeah, this is like, I feel this one in my bones. So Setia writes in this book, he says, I turned 40, a tenured professor with a wife and a child, 2 books, and 20-odd articles in print. I love the profession of philosophy, but not with the fire I had 10 years ago. The novelty of accomplishment is gone. First publication, first lecture, first day of class. I'll finish the paper I'm writing. It will eventually be published. I'll write another. I'll teach these students. They'll graduate and move on. I'll teach more. The future is a tunnel of glass. The rest of life goes by in its variety elsewhere. My son will grow. My wife and I grow older. My body creaks and sags. Back pain is a trusted companion, not a sometimes visitor. I use a standing desk. My parents are getting on, their health increasingly precarious. I feel the finitude of life. The years are numbered. Time is moving fast. And he goes on to say, I knew I was lucky to be doing what I love, and yet there was something hollow in the prospect of doing more of it, in the projected sequence of accomplishments stretching through the future to retirement, decline, and death. When I paused to contemplate the life I had worked so hard to build, I felt a disconcerting mixture of nostalgia, regret, claustrophobia, emptiness, and fear. So I think this is a very powerful set of reflections. Personally, they really resonate with me. And I highly, by the way, recommend this book from Setia, Midlife, A Philosophical Guide. In fact, I recall having precisely these feelings a few years ago when I received tenure. I'll talk about that in just a minute, but I do want to point out that what Setia is describing here is not nihilism, right? Goals and accomplishments matter. Of course they do. They have value. We might even think objective value. But at the same time, Setia says in impeccably Schopenhauerian fashion that the numerous accomplishments which give his life meaning and direction are bittersweet. They're longed for, they're pursued, they're ultimately disappointingly complete. That's over with. What now? And as I mentioned just a moment ago, I personally felt quite vividly feelings very much of this sort. Shortly after receiving tenure, in fact. And so this is how I put it in a tweet at the time, just confessing my feelings into the bowels of cyberspace. So I wrote, I feel guilty admitting it, but a strange melancholy has overtaken me since receiving tenure. After years of neurotic, all-consuming work towards a major goal, suddenly I feel unmoored, not sure how or where to direct my energies. I'd be grateful for any advice. And of course, that was directed to academic Twitter. And I did receive some very good advice from a number of academics mainly, but also from a rabbi here in Reno, Nevada, who gave some wonderful advice as well, and some various other people as well. Now, Setia himself has some advice, some ingenious therapeutic advice for people who find themselves in the grip of Schopenhauer's dilemma. And I'll describe that advice in a moment. But first, let me just say another quick word about how Schopenhauer himself saw his way through the dilemma that I've been sketching for you this evening. So according to Schopenhauer, it is possible technically, albeit extremely difficult, to obviate the suffering produced by the will. He thinks that we can escape the perpetual seesaw of pain and boredom by strangling the will, thereby achieving what the Buddhists call nirvana, the end of craving, or willing, the end of willing, and with it, of course, the cessation of suffering. I have to say, though, for many non-Buddhists like me, there's a certain kind of paradox inherent in the idea of nirvana, in the idea that the will might somehow deny itself. I keep thinking, wouldn't any such denial just be yet another manifestation of that very same will? But paradox aside, I think it's also right to ask whether having goals and projects really is as bad as Schopenhauer makes it out to be. Is it really so bad to have projects? Is satisfying desires and then needing to replace them with new desires and goals really the unbridled misery that Schopenhauer sometimes makes it out to be? Is our only hope really the full renunciation of our will, a smothering of all desire, a feat, incidentally, that only a tiny number of people will actually be able to pull off? So Setia thinks that a more promising path of spiritual progress, as he calls it, which incidentally also draws inspiration from Buddhist thought, but in a different way than Schopenhauer. Setia's path begins with the appreciation of an ancient distinction between two kinds of activities, telic activities and atelic activities. And this is sort of from the ancient Greek word telos, which means purpose or end or outcome, or the thing towards which something strives, as it were. So consider the various activities that make up your life. Driving home from work, going for a walk, eating sushi, watching football on TV, shoveling snow, washing dishes, and so on and so on. Some of these activities are telic, again, from the ancient Greek word telos, which is to say they aim at terminal states at which they are finished and thus exhausted. Driving home is a telic activity. It's done when you get home, right? Other activities, however, are atelic, which is to say they don't take aim at a point of termination or exhaustion, a final state in which they have been achieved. Playing with your children, doing yoga, listening to music are all good examples of atelic activities. Obviously, you can and will stop doing these things at some point. No one can do yoga forever. But the activities themselves cannot be completed. They're unfinishable. As Setia says, quote, they have no limit, these atelic activities, no outcome whose achievement exhausts them and therefore brings them to an end. So to sort of sum up, atelic activities are essentially unfinishable. Now, Setia thinks that a propensity for the telic is the jet fuel that powers his midlife crisis. He's been too telically minded all these years. He's grown too accustomed to successfully achieving goals, to getting things done. But a certain feeling of futility and emptiness is the result. One is inclined to think, is this all there is? Just more goals, additional projects, further items on a constantly replenishing checklist? A quote from Setia, he says, I've spent 4 decades acquiring a taste and an aptitude for the telic, for achievement and the next big thing, for personal and professional success, only to feel the void within. Fulfillment always lies in the future or in the past. That's no way to live, close quote. So Setia's advice is not to renounce the will completely, as both Schopenhauer and the Buddha would recommend that we do, but rather to afford atelic activities a more prominent place in your life, to recognize that there's more to life than simply getting things done, more to life than being productive. There's pleasure in going for a walk, he writes, just wandering or hiking, not to get anywhere, but for the sake of walking itself. Walking is atelic. Unlike walking home, it doesn't aim at its own completion, a point at which there is no more to do, close quote. Now, I think maybe you'll agree, and maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A in a few minutes, but I think that there's a great deal of therapeutic wisdom in this recommendation. Spending more time on activities that can't be completed, that have no built-in terminus, will help us feel, I think, less like hamsters running on a wheel. It will soothe the sense of interminability and futility that accompanies Schopenhauer's dilemma. After all, this is a deep truth, I think, not everything is a project. A healthy human life should have within it space for activities that are not accomplishments, which is not to say, of course, that accomplishments don't matter. They obviously do matter or can matter. But the point is that we human beings are not merely machines for the completion of projects, and our lives should be lived in a way that reflects this deep truth. Now, a telic activity can't technically be transformed into an atelic activity. An activity is either exhaustible or it isn't exhaustible. But a telic activity can be performed in an atelic way, with an atelic spirit or with an atelic ethos. So there's, I think, a distinction to be drawn between the kinds of activities that one performs and the attitude or ethos or spirit with which one performs the activity. And I don't think it's hard to see how these two, the activity itself and the spirit with which it's completed, can and do frequently come apart. So a person can perform an atelic activity in a telic spirit, and conversely, it's possible to imagine someone performing a telic activity in an atelic spirit. So here's an example. Meditation is a quintessentially atelic activity. It has no built-in endpoint, no built-in terminus. There's no natural point of termination or exhaustion. And yet, you could easily imagine someone who judiciously keeps track of how much they're meditating, who carefully logs and times each session. You could even imagine this person like getting competitive about it, fixated on the goal of becoming like the best meditator in their neighborhood, of logging the most meditation hours and becoming the most consistent daily meditator or something like that. Now, that would be an odd way, I think, to approach the activity of meditating, to treat it as yet another project, as opposed to a hiatus, a break from one's projects, but it's not inconceivable. In fact, I have a meditation app on my phone that encourages users to set goals for their meditation practice. The app keeps track of the number of meditation sessions a user has completed, their streak, quote unquote, of consecutive days meditating, the total minutes meditated per day, per month, you name it. So that would be an example of an atelic activity, meditating, that doesn't have an end, yet performed with a telic mindset, as it were. It's also possible, conversely, to imagine the performance of a telic activity, an activity which does have a natural end built into it, but it's possible to imagine it performed in an atelic spirit. And this possibility is beautifully expressed, to my way of thinking, by Zen master, Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, who you can see there he is a young Thich Nhat Hanh with Martin Luther King Jr. Both of them were anti-war activists at that time, anti-Vietnam War. Thich Nhat Hanh is a Vietnamese monk. And so Thich Nhat Hanh describes how a person can wash dishes in a mindful way. How a person can conceive of washing dishes, which is a telic activity through and through, right? We wash dishes in order to finish washing dishes and have clean dishes. But Thich Nhat Hanh is telling us, or trying to sketch, how we can do this telic activity in a quintessentially atelic spirit. So he writes, quote, "While washing the dishes, one should only be washing the dishes, which means that while washing the dishes, one should be completely aware of the fact that one is washing the dishes. The fact that I'm standing there and washing these bowls is a wondrous reality. I'm being completely myself, following my breath, conscious of my presence and conscious of my thoughts and actions." And he elaborates, and that's Thich Nhat Hanh today. Today he's 95, in fact, but he says there are two ways to wash the dishes. The first is to wash the dishes in order to have clean dishes. It's like telically. And the second is to wash the dishes in order to wash the dishes. If while we wash the dishes, we think only of the cup of tea that awaits us, thus hurrying to get the dishes out of the way as if they were a nuisance, then we are not washing the dishes to wash the dishes. What's more, we're not alive during the time we're washing the dishes. In fact, we're completely incapable of realizing the miracle of life while standing at the sink. If we can't wash the dishes, the chances are we won't be able to drink our tea either. While drinking the cup of tea, we will only be thinking of other things, barely aware of the cup in our hands. Thus, we are sucked away into the future, and we are incapable of actually living 1 minute of life, close quote. Now, I have to say, I don't know if Thich Nhat Hanh has read Arthur Schopenhauer, But this idea of sort of mindfully washing the dishes, adopting an atelic spirit towards the quintessentially telic activity of washing the dishes, feels to me almost like a direct response to the dilemma that Schopenhauer sketches for us. But of course, just to maybe explain the passage here, washing the dishes is paradigmatically a telic activity. We wash the dishes typically in order to complete the task, to have clean dishes, and the task is exhausted and brought to its natural conclusion when the dishes have been cleaned. And yet the suggestion here is that we try to adopt an atelic attitude towards the performance of this task. Thich Nhat Hanh is urging his readers and listeners to be conscious and mindful, to focus not on the completion of the activity per se, but rather on what he calls the wondrous reality of the present moment. Another way to think about all of this involves the idea that every telic activity has an atelic counterpart, so that, as Kieran Setia writes, when you cook dinner for your kids, help them finish their homework and put them to bed, all of them telic activities through and through, telic activities to the core, you thereby engage in the atelic activity of parenting. And I think, this is not just a linguistic trick. This is not just a, covertly, sneakily using the power of redescription to, basically say the same kind of thing. At its core, I believe, it's a powerful shift of perspective, a new way of relating to the world and of recognizing value in what one is doing. So in short, and to sum up now, the wisdom here is not only that we should make more room in our lives for atelic activities, although that's part of it too, it's also that we should try to adopt a more atelic attitude to all of our various tasks and activities. Not necessarily all the time and no matter what, but more consistently and more frequently than many of us are accustomed to do. If we focus more on atelic activities and try to bring a more atelic mindset to all of our daily doings, we're likely to have more peace and meaning in our lives. Striving always to be accomplishing something is exhausting, dispiriting, and anxiety producing. So to conclude, for whatever else he may have got wrong, and I think Schopenhauer got a whole lot of things wrong, he was right, nevertheless, to insist that striving always to be accomplishing something is no way to live a healthy, flourishing human life. So that's where I'll conclude. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. I do appreciate it, and I hope to be able to answer some of your questions if you have any now.
David, that was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. So thank you so much. We are going to open this up to questions now. So if folks do have questions, please do go ahead and put those in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We'll see those, and then I will make David respond to all of your questions in great detail. But maybe to start us off, I did just have a question. I want to go back to Schopenhauer for a moment before we kind of move on to this telic atelic distinction, which I find really interesting. And this is my first time hearing this mindset or this phrase as well. So I definitely want to push you on that as well. But first, for Schopenhauer, I'm really intrigued with this connection to Buddhism, this idea of kind of looking at desire as the root of this unhappiness, this root of pessimism in a sense, this idea that once you achieve one thing, it immediately starts off this new desire. And to me, like just listening to this seems very different from Buddhism in a way, where Buddhism is all about renouncing desire. It's all about being able to eventually renounce desire. I mean, another noble truth is the fact that you eventually get rid of desire as a way of moving on to the next thing. Right. And it seems, at least from this discussion of Schopenhauer, that I don't know if you ever get away from desire. So I guess the question would be this: for Schopenhauer, is it possible to get rid of desire? Is it possible to ultimately kind of cleanse yourself of desire and to be, I guess, happy, to use that broad of a term?
Yeah, he thinks it's possible, but it's not like the kind of thing that most people will be able to pull off. I mean, the Buddhists agree too. I mean, to achieve the full cessation of craving, I mean, you've got to give your life towards meditation and right, what the Buddhists call right mindfulness and so on, to achieve that task. So it's not like something that you can just kind of figure out on the weekend or something. But he does believe it's possible. It's possible to achieve a state. I think in some of his writings he calls it this sort of strangulation of the will. I'm not confident enough in my knowledge of sort of the quotidian details of Schopenhauer and of course Buddhist philosophy. I'm not confident enough there either to know if what Schopenhauer means by strangling the will is the very same thing as nirvana, what the Buddhists call nirvana. But I will say that a number of scholars in the secondary literature who write on Schopenhauer and Buddhism and other things say that it's basically the same idea. So yeah, I mean, I think he believes it's possible, but it's extremely difficult, and only a tiny minority of people will be able to pull it off. Like just the masters will be able to do it. Most of us are stuck with craving and desire, and thereby also with dukkha, with suffering as well. So good that we can laugh about it, though, at least. But yes.
It's a sad laugh. It's kind of just, a deep laugh so that we don't cry kind of thing.
That's right.
So I have some more questions, but there are some great questions coming in. So I'd like to start with these. I'm actually going to try to combine the questions by Meredith and Stephen, because they both get at this idea of kind of telic and atelic nature of things. Meredith talks about atelically washing dishes, which she's trying to do right now. And then also, I think, so maybe starting there, kind of talking about how we can do these daily things in an atelic way, and then moving on to education in particular. And so Stephen Pasqualina talks about how we could think about education in this way, so that it doesn't become about the end goal of grades or giving grades, or I mean, I think maybe for us as academics, the end goal of maybe achieving kind of finishing an article or publishing a book or something like that, but could maybe be a little bit more holistic, a little bit kind of education more broadly defined.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you both for those questions. Hi, Meredith and Stephen. So yeah, to Meredith's question, I like a good sort of American, I have a dishwasher here at home, so that's mostly how I wash the dishes. But I confess, I do like sometimes, Thich Nhat Hanh pops into my head sometimes when I'm, loading the dishwasher or like, scrubbing a pot or something like that. He does pop into my head. It's also the case, he has this little segment also about sort of how to eat an orange mindfully, with mindfulness. And so every time I'm, popping wedges of an orange into my mouth, I also think of him. So yeah, that's sort of a light question, and I appreciate that. But can you sort of just, because I think it went away, and can you just quickly summarize Stephen's thing again? Sorry to be.
No, of course. Yeah. So Stephen asked if you could speak a little bit about the atelic-telic distinction in regards to humanities education. So, and he says it's a pursuit that he takes to be fundamentally atelic, but somewhat tragically enmeshed in the instructional nature of grades and credentials. So, I mean, that's definitely looking at it as we kind of create this educational system for our students.
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry. So that's, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we are, the neoliberal university requires that we think about, enrollments all the time, and how many students are graduating, and how many tuition dollars are coming in, and so on. And we do perhaps lose sight of just the pure intrinsic value of education. I know all of us in liberal arts and the humanities, as a core humanities event, we believe profoundly in that. So I think the point is completely well taken. I mean, there is value in learning and reading and discovering interesting ideas, not to get something done. That process doesn't come to an end. It's not naturally exhaustible. So I think I agree that we would do very well to try to think about education, especially in the liberal arts, in more atelic terms. I don't see that happening anytime soon, candidly, but I agree that that would be the best and ideal way to indeed think about it. Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for that question, Stephen.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of approaching this issue. So staying on this atelic-telic distinction a little bit, there's a question here from Christopher, which I'm going to try to summarize a little bit. But he's wondering how we might move away from individualization, and a way if it would be possible to situate this in maybe more of a Marxist approach to societal and atelic growth, and especially developing a more cooperative challenge to this dilemma. So kind of moving from really focusing on the individual to focusing on society a little bit more broadly.
Yeah, no, thank you. And hi, Christopher. Christopher's a former grad student in philosophy. He's in law school now in Florida. He's, doing amazing. I think you're absolutely right. There is a sense, out there. I think we see this a lot in kind of a new stoicism, in a kind of Americanized, self-helpy version of Buddhism, where, right, these sort of ancient teachings are sort of called upon for sort of individual growth. Maybe anxiety management, do some meditation in your office, and then you can get back to work. So there's a kind of capitalist way to read a lot of that. I agree wholeheartedly that we should and could very easily think as a society about how we can create space for people, both as individuals, but maybe in groups as well, to have time in their day to engage in some activities that are atelic, that can't be completed. I saw this like meme not too long ago, like maybe on Twitter or something like that, where it was meant to be like uplifting. It's like, these are really tough times and people are struggling and gosh, it's, no one's feeling good right now. So, listen, if you can just do like a little bit, brush your teeth for 10 seconds, it's still better than not brushing them at all. Or like, walk like, 100 meters like around your neighbor. It's better than, it's still better than doing nothing. Maybe you didn't go for that long run you wanted to do, but still better. And I remember having the thought, like, I know it's well-intentioned and, it's aimed at helping people. But, the advice here is to just find some time to do things that aren't like projects, right? That aren't accomplishments. It's hard, I think, in American capitalist society to put oneself in a certain headspace where we're not trying to get anything done. We're just doing an activity that has value, maybe even objective value, not to complete it, but doing it sort of atelically, as it were. So, I mean, I take the point, Chris. I agree with you. I think we probably see perfectly eye to eye on that issue. And so thank you both for coming and also for that great question.
Excellent. So staying on this telic-atelic distinction for just a moment, we do have a question here or a comment here that's really challenging this a little bit. So I'm looking at the question here from Marina, where she says that the telic-atelic makes no sense. She says Satia is mistaken on this. Okay. She says for both Aristotle and Hegel, there's an elegant and meaningful distinction between activities that have telos within themselves and those that have the telos outside themselves. So, and she claims here that atelic is just randomness. So I would like to give you a chance to respond to this and respond to this critique on what Satia is saying and really looking at this atelic-telic distinction in general.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Thank you, Marina, and hi, thank you for coming to the talk. So it's interesting. I mean, Aristotle is the place where Satia himself locates that original, that distinction. I think he kind of makes it up himself a little bit. I mean, he says it comes from Aristotle, but does it exactly? I mean, I'll defer to you on that for sure. But I think, without fussing too much, we can make a sort of everyday distinction, maybe not an airtight, like rigorous philosophical distinction, but like an everyday in our lives distinction between those activities that we undertake primarily to finish them, right? Primarily to get them done, versus those activities that we undertake not to complete them, but just to do them and enjoy them. So, I mean, nobody puts on music. I love putting on music. I pump up a Spotify. I got some like speakers, play some music throughout the house. I mean, nobody does that in order to finish doing that, right? I mean, we do that to do that. There's a lot of activities. I mean, those of us who work in the university, we know, I mean, there are a lot of tasks and emails and assignments, a lot of things we do because we're expected to, and we do them to complete them. We do them to get them done. The point of them consists in their completion. But so, yeah, so even if, and I take your point, maybe we can talk about this, at some point too in person, but I take your point that it's hard to sort of make an airtight philosophical distinction there. But I think if you sort of adopt a looser, more everyday sort of point of view, I think we can readily distinguish, maybe not perfectly, maybe some activities will sort of be borderline cases and it'll be hard to parse them in one pile rather than another. But I think we can unproblematically make a division between sort of the kinds of activities that we do merely to get them done versus those that we do not to get them done, but just to do them, to enjoy the doing of them, as it were. So that's a non-answer. Your challenge is noted, and we'll chat more. But maybe that's the best I can do here and now. Thank you.
I think that's a great response. Thank you. So I'm going to change gears a little bit here. There's a question here from Durga, where they ask whether or not practicing gratitude, at least kind of, is this something that would at least be able to decrease our desires in life? So I mean, maybe if you could just talk a little bit about this relationship between gratitude and maybe this, going back to Schopenhauer, this idea of kind of desire and the nature of desire as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't thought about that. I don't know. It seems to me, again, just on the sort of face of it, without sort of having given it much thought, that maybe adopting a kind of a thankful stance where one is, I get right, where one sort of takes stock of all the good things there are in life and all of our good fortunes and sort of accentuates those things. Maybe that would redound to a kind of less craving-filled attitude. I'm not sure, but it's a really good suggestion. I'm going to sort of think more on that. My sort of intuitive knee-jerk reaction would be to say, yeah, I think you're onto something. I think that they might be connected. A sort of practicing gratitude and having fewer desires might go hand in hand, but I'd have to give that some more thought. But again, my initial inclination is to say probably so. Yeah, another sort of unsatisfactory answer. I'm sorry, but that would be my hunch anyways. Yeah.
No, I think that's great. So this one might be maybe a little bit quicker. So an anonymous attendee asks whether you think that we would have gotten along with someone like Schopenhauer, or are we only able to agree with them with regard to their philosophy?
Oh, yeah.
In your head already.
Oh, I don't think, Schopenhauer was an extremely difficult human being. I described a few, he threw a noisy seamstress down the stairs because he was being too loud, disrupting his concentration. No, I wouldn't want to be his friend. This guy was not a nice guy, a well-adjusted guy. No one liked him in his own day. He was sort of aggrieved all the time, and he never felt he was getting a fair shake, and he felt, always felt marginalized. It was just a horrible personality, even though his philosophy really accentuates these Buddhist elements. He thinks that compassion is so important. He writes beautifully about compassion as the basis of all morality. So, his philosophy, I think, is better than the dude. The dude, by all biographical accounts, he was horrible. Deeply paranoid, distrustful of everyone. I don't think he had any friends. Nietzsche himself says, I admire the philosopher, but this guy only liked to hang out with his dogs and so on. So yeah, to that question, I think I like some elements in the philosophy. I don't think I would wouldn't want to go for a beer with him. That's not on my list. Yeah. Thank you, though. That's a cool question. Yeah.
So since you mentioned Nietzsche, why don't we jump to this one? So how do you think Nietzsche would have approached Schopenhauer in this philosophy? And does it differ more than compare in general? And then this, Amelia asks whether this could be similar to the way he approaches this Apollonian and Dionysian distinction that he draws in his work, as well as maybe the Socratic view sets in the description of the artist as well.
Yeah, okay, that's a lot. That's big. So, Schopenhauer, of course, is a huge influence on Nietzsche. Nietzsche's candid about that. For everyone sort of thinking more about this, there's a beautiful essay by Nietzsche called Schopenhauer as Educator, and he sort of he gives praise to Schopenhauer. He acknowledges the tremendous influence. Nietzsche's idea of will to power, which is a central element in his philosophy, really comes from this centrality of the will in Schopenhauer. I think that's where sort of his most, maybe that's the sort of most obvious source there. So yeah, I think the question is a lot, but Nietzsche liked Schopenhauer a lot. I think the first thing I said in this talk was an early line from that essay in which he says, Schopenhauer was the only serious moralist of the 19th century. The rest are just, fussing around. Schopenhauer gets down to business. He zeroes in on the important stuff. So I think there's a lot in that question, and that would sort of take a lot of time. But I think the general answer, despite some obvious disagreements that they'd have, is that Nietzsche is a fan of Schopenhauer. Nietzsche admires him and looks up to him and was influenced by him a great deal.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions here. There's a question from Callum and another one from an anonymous attendee that ask about, so Callum's asking about these autotelic activities. So maybe ones with an end and purpose in and of themselves. And then he's saying that maybe this type of orientation might be helpful as a resource, kind of as we are in the midst of this very goal-oriented world. Maybe something that has the goal baked in, maybe makes it a little bit easier. I think he's looking for some kind of, maybe some help for all of us as we try to make sense of a very telic world. And then also the question here is also looking at this idea of whether this atelic mindset might help in alleviating anxiety as well. So maybe there's some way we could combine these two, this kind of idea of an autotelic activity with also something that maybe an atelic mindset also being helpful in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so maybe we can just leave them up for a second. So we're answering Callum's question, auto-atelic meaning ones. I see, yeah. So, well, let me riff quickly on the anxiety question. I mean, so this work on Schopenhauer and some of this stuff actually does come out of this current book project that I'm working on, which explores some of the connections between anxiety and philosophy. I think that it's absolutely right that an atelic activity or an atelic attitude is anxiety reducing. I mean, let's just think about all the things that we know are really good for managing anxiety, right? Like going for a hike in the mountains, or meditating, or I mean, I don't know, you name it, right? All the activity, going for a walk, or a nice conversation, or putting on some music, and I mean, everything that we know that is sort of non-pharmaceutically beneficial for treating anxiety. I mean, all of those activities I think will have in common the least common denominator, that they are kind of atelic in their nature. That we're sort of we're adopting a non-accomplishment centric point of view when we're doing those kinds of things, and yeah, it gives the mind a rest, and I think it is. I mean, I think we know it to I don't know if that is what explains the anti-anxiety property of those activities that I just sketched, but I don't think it's too far-fetched to think that what makes those activities so helpful for anxiety is precisely the idea that we're not trying to get something done. When we're focusing so much on our accomplishments, we're indelibly sort of we're living in the future. We're worried about how things may work out, whether we'll be successful in what we're trying to do, whether we'll encounter any obstacles. I mean, that's where anxiety lives and breathes. That sort of future-oriented. Kierkegaard is right about this. The anxiety is about the future necessarily, conceptually. It has to be. So yeah, I think on that point, I mean, I don't know that I can prove it, but it seems to me pretty clear and obvious that that the atelic is a powerful sort of anti-anxiety kind of point of view to take. With Callum's question here, the autotelic activities, meaning ones with an end or purpose in themselves. I'm not sure I quite get it. I know Callum loves to go on like epic bike rides, right? Like, 100-kilometer bike rides and races. And, part of problem, I bet that makes a person feel good. And I bet that is sort of therapeutically efficacious in a certain kind of way. Part of that might be, to sort of tie it to the first answer, part of what explains that might be the fact that, again, it's a kind of atelic thing. I mean, I guess if you're racing, you're probably pretty telic. You're trying to win, and you're, doing, overcoming obstacles and stuff. But maybe we can chat about that. I'm not sure I get the sort of autotelic idea there. I'd have to maybe give that a little bit of thought. And if I can, I noticed that early on, Greta put up a question about what were some helpful answers that I got to my plea for help on Twitter. Let me just say quickly, I mean, some really nice sort of just, and thank you for that question, Greta, just some really nice, like, sort of statements of, it's common, like it happens to a lot of people, especially after like a big milestone achievement, and, it won't last. A lot of philosophy professors are like, oh yeah, I felt that exact thing after tenure, that kind of thing. It goes away, and sure enough, it kind of goes away. It was acute sort of right afterwards, but I think that was the sort of the main advice. Other advice was like, try to do something completely different. Go research, take your research like in a radically new direction. That you can do that now and stuff like that. But yeah, it's a good question about that. Yeah.
No, it's a great question. I was actually saving that question for the end. That was going to be the our final thought here. But
I thought you were ignoring Greta. I'm sorry. So
no, I thought it was great. I wanted to be the last word, but no,
that's with your DJing here. I'm sorry. Yeah.
You're totally fine. I think it's a great question. Okay. Actually, I think this one might be kind of up your alley as well. How should we think about injustice with regard to this telic-atelic distinction? And the questioner here, Louise, says, I'm thinking about a systematic problem within society, and should we act towards injustice with a telic or atelic view?
Oh, that's a great question. So do we, I mean, injustice, we want to alleviate injustice. We want to we want a just world. So, okay, I think that the pursuit of justice is uncompletable. I see my colleague, Professor Achtenberg, is here as well in the chat. I mean, Jacques Derrida likes to say that justice, right, is always to come, always à venir, right? Never quite realizable. But I think that's exactly, there's never a point at which you get to and say, that's it, work here is done, justice realized, complete. So it's not completable in that sense, but I think you're asking, Luis, about how the attitude or ethos we should undertake when we're engaging in like justice relevant activities, is that right? So should we treat like marching and mobilizing as sort of something you do to get done, or something to do? That's a good question. I have to think hard about that. That's probably going to depend on the person that we're talking about. You know, some people enjoy those kinds of activities sort of in and of themselves, independent of the justice of the cause that they're working towards. They just enjoy, like, I don't personally like being in a big crowd of like marchers. I don't like that sort of feeling very much. I mean, I've been in crowds of marchers, but it's not like something that I would seek out for its own sake, certainly. Some people like it though. They like the feeling of camaraderie and togetherness and lots of humans all around and so on. So maybe, Luis, the answer to your question could depend from person to person on some of their sensibilities. But it's a terrific question. I have to think about that a little bit more. Thank you for that.
Thank you. So it seems like a couple folks are building off of Marina's question here. So Deborah mentions that there's this Aristotelian distinction is between actions that have a telos and actions that are telos. So the latter are not incomplete, but complete in every moment. And then Dustin builds off this as well. And he says, related to Dr. Marin's question, does an activity not having a terminus necessarily mean that it not have an end? Good health is something that one never achieves. It's something that we would continually work towards, but it's still something that we need to work towards. I'm paraphrasing slightly. And then he also adds, from a Kantian perspective, that is viewing yourself as an end. Is an atelic activity even possible when these kinds of activities really serve to end, or kind of serve the end of self-constitution?
Yeah. Yeah, I really do appreciate all these questions. They're like philosophically sharp, and I appreciate them. And I think, maybe it's too bad as I say, Kieran Setia he gave a talk to our department, I think 3 weeks ago, maybe to the day. Should have pushed him on this a little bit. It's his sort of, he says it comes from Aristotle, but he also sort of is helping himself to his own sort of, he's being liberal with it in a certain kind of way. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, look, the distinction to me, I mean, I don't know how much you can press it until it dissolves. And I think there's a few questions to that effect. I think it's most plausible as a distinction when we think about sort of like obvious instances, like, washing the dishes, maybe, right? I mean, unless you're unless you're a Zen master, you wash the dishes in order to get to the end of the task and complete the task. I mean, you don't undertake the task for its own sake. I mean, as opposed to, like, let's say, listening to music. I mean, I would just say, and this is not going to be satisfactory, and the people asking these questions, we're going to talk again. I know that, and we can chat about this. I know it's not going to be satisfactory, but I think that we can uphold the distinction, Setia's distinction, if we just sort of keep it loose in that way. Maybe there's some borderline cases. Maybe there's some activities. I mean, I think Luis's question speaks to this too, where it's not quite clear. I mean, would it be a telic activity? Is marching for justice, a telic activity or an atelic activity? There, it's less clear. It's more clear to me when you contrast sort of washing the dishes versus doing yoga or meditating or something like that. That's more clear. So, I mean, again, this is not a satisfactory response to these challenges, which are right and just. But I think, the distinction is sort of helpful as far as it goes. And I don't know how far it goes. I think I was anticipating that there were going to be some philosophical pushback about the ultimate sustainability of this distinction, and I accept it as correct. But I think the sort of advice to Schopenhauer's dilemma still holds, even if the atelic-telic distinction is not as sort of airtight as maybe Setia wants it to be, and as some of you have sort of problematized it in this chat here. So again, That's not acceptable as an answer, but it's what I got this evening.
No, I think it's great. I'm sad now that we're not all in person and we could have this debate really kind of going back and forth a bit more directly. So we are unfortunately basically out of time, but I thought maybe, David, if you're willing, we'll do one more question, and then I think for the other folks, maybe they can look for you on campus, they can send you an email, yeah. I'm sure you would be happy to continue these discussions.
Yes, well, let me say that I love to talk about philosophy and stuff. Yeah, if you want to seek me out on campus, or absolutely send me an email, I'd be happy to chat more. Yeah, sorry that we can't get to all of these questions tonight, and thank you for asking these questions as well.
Yeah, I think this discussion has been really fantastic. I think it's been great. So just to end maybe on something a little bit possibly more positive. So I'm actually looking at Stephen's question here about love, and so this is, do you know how or if Schopenhauer accounts for love? And he says he'd love to hear a Schopenhauerian, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Schopenhauerian. Anyways, approach to love, a category of experience enmeshed in desire, but in its pure form beyond desire. So yeah, I'm intrigued as well.
So I don't know. I don't know. Beyond desire. Yeah. I think, Schopenhauer's category of morality looks a little bit like that too. To take up a sort of moral point of view for Schopenhauer is to sort of be non-instrumental in a certain way. It's to take the sort of suffering and of each individual on its own terms. It's not to like be a utilitarian and do math and say, well, this heap of suffering is less than this one. It's to sort of accord every ounce of suffering in the universe its own place. He thinks compassion is at the root of all of morality. That's sort of the main thesis of his book On the Basis of Morality. Compassion, Mitleid in the German, is about, again, sort of approaching someone non-instrumentally, not with an agenda, right? To just kind of like appreciate their being as such, just let their suffering sort of speak as such. So there is a kind of like beyond desire, satiation element in Schopenhauer. I don't know that much about what he has to say about love, but I think in the his moral philosophy, that book On the Basis of Morality, we'd find sort of something in the ballpark of what Stephen is alluding to. So again, I'm not a Schopenhauer expert by any means. It's he's what I presented here is a little snippet. He's got a full philosophy that is, a metaphysics and epistemology and an ethics, and it hangs together. It's a coherent whole. This is a little sort of sliver of this whole sort of edifice that he presents. So it's a great question, Stephen. Maybe we can chat about it sometime in the future. I don't know that much about what Schopenhauer has to say about love. Nothing comes to mind on that score at the moment. Let me just say, Breton, before you, so I see questions from Jalen and Ivan, again, former students. I just want to say hello to them and acknowledge them and thank them for being there as well. Even though we couldn't get to your questions, maybe we can, chat independently at some other time as well.
Excellent. Well, David, thank you so much for taking the time. I think the talk was fantastic. Thank you everyone who attended. I thought this Q&A, I thought these questions were some of the best I've seen. I think this has really just been a fantastic discussion. So thank you all for attending. David, thank you for the talk. I think it was great. And with that, I will say good night. So
good night, everyone. Thank you for coming out today.